Hello, y'all. Thank you for tuning in to part one of Jesus and the Refugee. I am Pastor Lucas. I hope that you make yourself comfortable, and I appreciate you giving this a listen. This is sort of a new platform we're trying for Christian education, and it is an attempt to make sure that even if you couldn't join us on Zoom for the live conversation, you still receive the content. Um, in person, either literally in person or on Zoom, live is always better because you get an opportunity to have conversation with one another, an opportunity to ask any of your questions. You may not get that otherwise, except to say that my door is always open. I would love to schedule a time to meet with you, especially if we have conversations around important topics like Christian values of welcome and inclusion. A lot of pastors and theologians, if I'm being honest with you, have to do a lot of interpretive work to make the ancient world in which the Old Testament and the New Testament, mostly written in the first century, but the Old Testament is ancient. A lot of pastors and theologians have to do a lot of work, interpretive work, and sometimes that is difficult. It feels like you're doing theological gymnastics sometimes to make the old text fit into the 21st century. That's true for a lot of topics. However, immigration is not one of those topics. This is a key theme throughout all of Scripture. If you miss the theme of immigrants, of accepting strangers and people moving to foreign lands, if you miss that narrative in the scripture, you will have missed a gigantic chunk of the entire Bible. And so there are all kinds, thousands probably, of stories that we could talk about today that lift up this theme of migration, people traveling to foreign lands. So there's definitely a racial component to a lot of the Bible. There's an ethnicity question, and there is people on the move all the time. It's a very nomadic world that the Bible is written in. People are on the move for all kinds of reasons. Either they're persecuted, they're kicked out. That's called exile. They're kicked out of their land, or there's a famine or some sort of disaster that moves people to a new place. That happens all the time in the Bible. We're going to lift up 6 different characters or stories in the Bible. Now, these 6 stories are meaningful to me, but they also come from the book, The God Who Sees. And we thank Karen Gonzalez for her hard work in presenting these stories in this way for us. I encourage you to read that book, purchase it online, and give it a read, especially if this story is of interest to you. She definitely goes a lot deeper into these 6 different stories. The first story is that of Naomi and Ruth. Elimelech is the husband of Naomi, and both Elimelech and Naomi are from Bethlehem. This is the region of Judah. These are the Hebrew people. That's a theme throughout all of the Old Testament, knowing who the Hebrew people are. And so in this region of Judea, particularly in Bethlehem, where Naomi and Elimelech are from, there is a severe famine in the region. So, because they need to survive and they weren't being prosperous in Judah at the time, they go to a place called Moab. Moab is on the other side of the Dead Sea. It's in the southeast corner that they are traveling. So it's actually not terribly far in terms of miles, but it's a long trek because you have to go all the way around the Dead Sea. You can't swim in the Dead Sea, there's too much salt. And so you have to go all the way around the Dead Sea. And so it's a long journey, but not that far, to a place called Moab, a foreign place of where Moabites live. And Moabites historically don't necessarily get along with the Hebrew people. And so, but they move there anyway out of necessity because there's a famine and they're trying to survive. So again, they're flee to a new place for security reasons. And while they're there, Naomi has a son, and her son marries a woman named Ruth. So the relationship between Naomi and Ruth is mother and daughter-in-law. And they become really tight. Their family becomes really close, but a tragedy happens. And both Elimelech and Ruth's husband die. And so now Ruth and Naomi are both widowed in this strange place. Well, at least a strange place for Naomi. Ruth was from there. This is her daughter-in-law was from Moab, and she's a Moabite. But now these women are husbandless, they're widowed, and at this time in the ancient world, if your husband dies, it is almost certainly a life sentence of poverty because it's a very patriarchal world. Your wealth is tied to your husband. And so if your husband dies, very, very frequently, you were now impoverished. So Naomi and Ruth, both widowed, are now in poverty in Moab. And Naomi has this idea, well, if I'm going to be poor here, I might as well be poor back where I'm from in Judea, in Bethlehem. So she decides to leave Moab. And there's this beautiful story about whether or not Ruth is going to follow Naomi to Naomi's home country with the Hebrew people. And there's this beautiful poem. This poem was actually read at my wedding, believe it or not. And you probably are familiar with this. This is Ruth chapter 1, verse 16. Where you go, I will go. Where you live, I will live. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. It's this beautiful testimony for how loyal and loving Ruth is toward her mother in law. And so Ruth takes on the courage and the boldness to go with Naomi back to Naomi's hometown in Bethlehem. And Naomi is trying to encourage her not to do this because she is aware that Moabites and the Hebrew people don't get along. And so she thinks that Ruth will not be accepted there. But despite that, Ruth gives a powerful testimony and she goes with Naomi back to her home country. And here is the whole point of this story, because it's setting the tone that Ruth is not going to be well received in this foreign land among the Hebrew people. And thus we get introduced to a man named Boaz. Boaz is also a farmer, and he employs Ruth. He welcomes her. He shows her hospitality. He gives her safety and comfort and security. And Ruth is obviously scared that she will be mistreated. And you get a good insight on this in Ruth chapter 2, verse 9, where Boaz says to Ruth, "Keep your eyes on the field that is being reaped and follow behind them. I have ordered the young men not to bother you." So Ruth was worried about sexual assault, and and Boaz puts a stop to that. And he says, "If you get thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn." So Boaz is protecting her, giving her safety and security in this native land. And the whole point of this story is to reveal how Boaz, and Naomi for that matter, defy expectations. And they instead are welcoming and loving to this foreign woman named Ruth. And Boaz is the protagonist in this story. And what I particularly enjoy about it is the reasoning for why Boaz is so loving toward Ruth. It's not out of an above and beyond sense of generosity or kindness, but Boaz says he is living into the Torah, the ancient law. He's insisting that it is necessary and a part of what it means to be a faithful person, to welcome the stranger and the foreigner. He quotes Leviticus chapter 19, verses 33 through 34. Where he says, "When foreigners reside in your land, you shall not oppress the foreigner. The foreigner who resides with you shall be with you as a native born among you. You shall love the foreigner as yourself, for you are strangers in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God." So that's Leviticus, and Leviticus is meant to be the book of the rules, right? It's God laying out the covenant. If you want to be my people, follow these rules. Thus, the book of Leviticus. And Boaz is doing this not out of some above and beyond sense of generosity, but because it is what is commanded of him by God. And so this story presents an opportunity for Boaz and Naomi to love the stranger, to welcome the foreigner in this new place. And so that is true for us today, I believe. How we treat our foreigners, how we treat immigrants in this land is an opportunity for us to reveal our godlike character or not. But it is an opportunity for us to demonstrate what God's love and welcome and inclusion looks like. That is the crux of this story, and it is a beautiful story. I invite you to read the entire book of Ruth when you have time. It is a beautiful story, and you'll definitely pick up on the theme of people being in new places for all kinds of reasons. It begs the question, do you think Ruth would be received and accepted in our country today?
Some places.
Some places.
Well, I was going to say today, I'd probably say no.
The refugees, back after the Vietnam War, that was a whole program. I read in the book that the difference between refugees and what do you call them, asylees or something. There's money put aside to help these people, find places to live and acquire food and training for jobs and all that. What happened to all that?
Wonder if she had not gotten that support from Boaz, and she was just left there with uh, her mother-in-law and her going into this area. I think the key part is, I know there's a lesson in there, but if we take it apart from the lesson, I wonder if she didn't get that support from such a high official, that it would have been different for her. Take any other person who was there. Boaz is concerned that she be treated well and not be taken advantage of. I'll use that word. That's pretty calm, but it could be worse for her. So I think there's a big difference at that point. Now, I know the lesson is for us to look at what Boaz has done, but if he hadn't done that, I think it would be a totally different experience.
So one of Anne mentioned the refugee status. One of the things to note about whether or not Ruth would be accepted as a refugee here today is that in order to qualify to be a refugee, you have to sort of prove that you've been persecuted where you are, which, as you can imagine, is very difficult to do. And we don't really get a specific persecution from Ruth in her where she's from. So she's not necessarily fleeing persecution. She's definitely fleeing poverty, but that's not necessarily the same thing as persecution. So she probably wouldn't qualify for refugee status in this country. Also, I'm sure she has skills because she's a person, but it's not addressed about any specific education or discernible skills that Ruth has. So she probably wouldn't qualify for a visa in this country. And also, she's a daughter-in-law of Naomi, and that doesn't qualify you for sponsorship either. It just goes to show how this story I think, is trying to shape and reframe how we practice generosity and welcome and hospitality at the borders. And to make sure, and I would say, by the way, she probably wouldn't be accepted in this country. That's probably true for the last century. Yes, we have waves where we're more welcoming than others. But in general, our mission as people who are trying to follow the law, as Boaz is demonstrating here, or the New Testament law to love your neighbor, right? Um, it's going to not always gel with the legal processes in place. So morality and legality are not necessarily the same thing. And so I wonder how we as a country can use this story and example of Boaz to extend a hospitable arm to those who are in need.
Might be similar to World War II with the war brides. They they tied up with American soldier and then they were able to come back here. So that was a sponsorship. So it's kind of, if you could find a sponsorship, you might have gotten in. But
Yeah.
finding a sponsorship is difficult.
What do you know about Father Abraham? You might recall those Sunday school stories and songs. Father Abraham had many sons. You know how it goes. And indeed, Abraham is a prominent figure in the book of Genesis. However, if you actually read the story of Genesis, Abraham is not such a nice guy. There's one story in particular I'm thinking of, and this is a bit of a dark story, so I apologize. But there's Abraham and his wife Sarai, who was later called Sarah. So Abraham and Sarah, they live in the modern country of Iraq. They move down to Egypt because there's a famine where they're from, and so they move down to Egypt for prosperity's sake. And while they're there, Abraham does something pretty awful. He's afraid that the men of Egypt are going to kill him in order to have access to his wife. And so he lies. He says that his wife is his sister, so that he'll stay alive. They won't kill him if Sarah is his sister and not his wife. So he lies and says that she is his sister, and he essentially pimps Sarah out for survival's sake to the men of Egypt. It's a kind of a terrible story and a terrible example of what it means to be a follower of God. However, we've been told all our lives of this counter story of how amazing and wonderful Abraham is. My point in sharing that story is to try to help you understand that it can be really, really easy to paint bad people in a positive light, and it can also be really easy to paint good people in a bad light. And if I know that you don't have a relationship with somebody, it becomes really easy for me to convince you of whatever I want you to believe about the person. I think that is the story that is happening a lot here in our country today. If I know that you don't know immigrants, I know that you'll believe that they're dirty, rotten, smelly, and no good. The only antidote to not falling victim to that lie is lived real world experiences of the opposite example. Did you know that 80% of people who are trafficked in this country are foreign born? Did you know that? Did you know that you are far more likely to run into a native born criminal than a foreign born criminal in this country? We're told the opposite of what is true. And the only way you're going to believe me is lived real world experiences. That's why relationships are so important. That's why building community with your neighbor is so important. Um, if you love your neighbor, you are in relationship with your neighbor. And if you are in relationship with your neighbor, then you will learn to love your neighbor. And so this is a circle of compassion and inclusion that God calls us into. So who is your neighbor? And who And who is your neighbor? And what have you been told about your neighbor? And how does that compare to your lived real world experiences? What are we told to believe about immigrants?
Most of them are criminals. That's what I read.
Mhm. I have seen it not so much today, but in the past few years, growing up in Michigan and in Dearborn, we had a lot of Muslims. And from the time I was very, very young, growing up in the 50s, 40s. And now, you hear, oh, those people are horrible. No, when they're your neighbors and your friends, you just have a very different way of looking at them. But people take things and they don't, it's like they'll grasp for the worst. They're not looking for the good in them. They're looking for some reason to be prejudiced against them.
Unfortunately, I think we have so few opportunities to have these lived experiences with immigrants. I think of where we are in Florida and how close we are to Immokalee and what these people go through, and yet so many of us don't have the opportunity to get to really know them. I was privileged, and it's been over 20 years now, to be a part of a family. The first child was born. Well, he's now 20 something. And then there was a second boy, and the girl now is 12. The mother was 19 when she came over to this country, and with nothing, across the border to come to Immokalee to work, to send money home to her family, and ended up in Immokalee in a trailer with 17 other people. But going in there and meeting her and then going to the hospital when she had her first baby, we created such a bond. And when you say lived experience, I wouldn't give up that experience with this family for anything. And I wish so many more of us could have those kinds of experiences in this country. I think it would be a very different thing. Rather than listening to the untruths, we get to see the real truths in some of the families.
There's another story involving Abraham in relation to Hagar. Hagar is a slave woman in the Abraham household. The word Hagar literally means foreign thing, so it's not very polite of a name. She is basically the handmaiden of Sarah. And for a long time, Abraham and Sarah were unable to conceive a son. So they developed this plan where Abraham is going to have relations with Hagar so that they can finally have a son. Now, in my interpretation, this is a non consensual relationship between Abraham and Hagar. However, the plan works, and Hagar gets pregnant to who will eventually be Ishmael. And while she's pregnant, something else happens. Just so happens that the original plan finally worked, and Abraham and Sarah are now able to conceive a son. He'll be named Isaac. So the question then becomes for Abraham, what do you do with Hagar and her new son Ishmael? Well, he kicks them to the curb, sends them into the desert. So traveling alone, we have this foreign, poor woman with no husband who would have been Abraham, and she's by herself in the desert. She gets kicked out of the house. And while she's in the desert, something pretty amazing happens. God says to her, I will make your son a great ruler of nations. most noteworthy about it is this is the first time in the Bible. It's called the first annunciation. It's the first encounter that humans have with God is Hagar, a foreign-born slave woman. I think that's a powerful story, and I think it could and should be empowering for people who feel not good enough or unworthy, that God is the first to speak to you. Now, that great nation is later going to be Islam, and the Islamic religion follows the story then of Hagar and Ishmael. But I would pose to you the question, what does it mean that God shows up not to the master of the household, but to the maid? How does this story of God's accompaniment, of God's inclusion, of God's concern, how does that impact people in this world who maybe don't have the status, the power, and who are less fortunate and marginalized and discounted? What does Hagar's story teach us about how we are called to treat and love all people? How might you read the story from the perspective of the person who is the slave, the woman, the migrant in poverty, to know that God speaks to you first? What might that evoke from you?
Strength and hope when I read some of these stories of these other immigrants and what they go through when they come here and have lost everything and, take on jobs that are, difficult, hard work to try to, support their families. It's like I don't know, it strengthens them, the relationship with God. I think it shows their faith.
I guess I'm hoping that it would give her some hope, because being out in the desert in that harsh environment alone with your son, I would imagine that must be very hopeless. To the extent of, well, how are we going to manage and live? But if she has that vision and that contact with God, I would hope that it would give her some hope that I am not alone. We aren't alone. And the future may be brighter. I don't think it sells anything about where are we going to eat, where are we going to find food. Hoping it gives her some hope.
For me, the story is an example of God's preferential option for the poor.
Say more about that. I'm familiar with that, but say more about what that means.
God is on their side, even though it doesn't appear. And that's why, people have talked about strengths. I'm amazed with some of the strengths that these people have and what they have gone through. And from what I've seen from my family, it's like such a strong faith. People of Nicaragua also showed that incredible strength, and that kept them safe going through a lot of things that we would not imagine having to go through. Terms of finding food, the housing, and yet they were very happy people. They were very God-filled people, as far as what I knew of them. And this God's preferential option for the poor, I've heard that so many times through Catholic social teaching. But it's nice to put some examples on that frame.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's helpful for for us to, and this is a very, maybe this is a privileged point of view. It probably is from my perspective, so I'll claim that. But um, it's because I'm not the bullied. I ask myself, what is my job as the person who's against bullying, and bullying as in the broader sense of the word, mistreating people, being unkind, that kind of thing. As somebody who is not the bully, I don't, at least I try really hard not to be, although we all fall short, of course. And as the person who's not the bullied, okay, what is our role then? I think this story is a good example and a way for us to learn how to do what God does, and that is give voice to the voiceless and pay attention to the marginalized and the poor and oppressed. If God was not didn't have a preferential option for the poor, then he would have ignored this story of Hagar altogether. The minute that Abraham kicked her and Ishmael out, their story would be lost forever. But that's not how the story goes. Instead, it's the exact opposite. So I think our role as a church and modern people who aren't the bullied and not the bullier, our job is to stand up for the defenseless and the voiceless. And so all you have to do is tell me who's being bullied, and I'll tell you where we're called to stand. Fast forward a few generations to the story of Joseph. You probably know Joseph from the famous musical Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat. I'm a huge fan. That's my first exposure to Joseph. But we rarely hear about the details of this story. So Joseph is the son of Jacob, and he has a lot of brothers, and his brothers get super jealous of Joseph, so much so that they sell him into slavery. And so Joseph is sent into slavery in the land of Egypt, where he's an immigrant. And he is a pretty good slave, whatever that means. He's probably a hard worker. For whatever reason, he gets promoted as a slave into the land of, or into the house of Pharaoh. So now he's working directly with the immediate family of Pharaoh, and Pharaoh's wife accuses Joseph of making sexual advances on her, and she accuses him of sexual assault, and the Pharaoh believes his wife, and of course, because Joseph is already a foreigner, it's easy to cast him in this light, and so Pharaoh is quick to believe, and so the innocent Joseph gets sentenced to prison, where he spends most of his life in prison. But that Pharaoh ends up dying. The Pharaoh that had the beef with Joseph ends up dying, and a new Pharaoh is in town and has the power. And he remembers meeting Joseph in prison. He remembers being impressed by him. So he calls Joseph out of prison and he puts him in a very high status position of being his dream interpreter. So Joseph leaves prison to go back to the Pharaoh's court, a new Pharaoh, and interprets his dreams for him. It just gets me thinking about the wave of different kinds and levels of welcome that people in power have. One Pharaoh is against Joseph, a new Pharaoh is supportive of Joseph, and it makes a difference who's in power. And I wonder if you think about the history and the trajectory of welcoming immigrants in our country, I wonder what it has looked like, where of where we have been quick to include and where we have been slow to include. I invite you to inquire about your own family's history. Who were the first person in your family to come over to the United States? I think everybody should know their own stories, their own family's story about how they got here. Quickly learn that we are all immigrants to this land, unless you're native to these lands. But we are all immigrants at one point, and I would ask you to inquire and research and learn how your family was welcomed here. For me, most recently, my family came from Wales on my mother's side, and she came during the peak of Ellis Island. I want to say 1924, if I got that right. And I remember hearing her story about meeting her family that was already here, and there was a lot of drama around that. But it goes to show that everybody who first came to the United States was at some point illegal or undocumented. Nobody came here with their documentation. They received their documentation. Now, Ellis Island, you would receive your documentation in a few hours, and you'd be allowed into the country. Yes, they processed people, but the whole thing, the whole process took 12 hours at most. And so, you know, I implore you to think about your own story, your own family story. And I wonder, did they come here in a time that was more hospitable and welcoming, or did they were they met with struggles and persecution and mistreated on their voyage over here? The answer to that question probably depends a lot on when they came and who was in power when they came and what was the nation's attitude at the time in which they came. Um, I think it's important that everybody know their story.
What I saw, again, growing up in Michigan, we had a lot of people. It was very welcoming during a lot of Hungarians, a lot of because there were jobs, in the automobile industry. So I want to say they were welcome. They weren't overly, they were just accepted, right? Uh, there was no question. Everybody was from a different Polish people that, they had all gone through tragedies and they came and everybody was good.
And now people worry about actually, well, you hear stories about they're gonna take over the job that should be ours. But a lot of the farms and everything are suffering because of the immigration policies we have and don't let these, illegal immigrants work here anymore. So, we need new laws, I guess. We need them, definitely need them.
I think you just said how we treat foreigners is linked to who's in power. Did I get that right?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think about the dreamers, those kids who came with their parents and were able to, live and work in this country and were treated very well, at least I think since the 80s and 90s. And now they're looked upon as less than and are going through hard times. One family that I know, the woman's been working for 10 years, came right up to being able to get citizenship, but now is probably going to have to wait for, well, it, it was marked temporary instead of being given to her, and probably it's in process now, could be as long as 8 years before that becomes permanent because of the backlog of lawyers. So there was a big change as far as who's in power and how they're being treated.
I like to just remind people that there are far more, Anne mentioned this, there are far more job vacancies than there are people. And I always like to just, because I think this is just interesting to think about, is that, China and the United States has about the same land mass in size. If you get rid of Alaska, it's about the same land mass and size.
Hmm.
And if you took everybody in the Western Hemisphere, everybody in South America, Latin America, if you took everybody and put them into the United States, China, with the same landmass, would still have more population.
Mm.
Isn't that kind of crazy? So
Yeah.
there's,
Yeah.
and people like to say that there's no room here, or we don't have room. There's plenty of room, physically room. And like I said, there's more job openings than there are people to fill them. So this isn't a question of logistics. We could figure out the logistics. The question is to what degree are we called to welcome people? And what this is a really important point that I want to stress is that um, our immigration policy, again, this is probably from somebody in a place of privilege, but as somebody who's in the United States, um, it is our collective immigration process. And if that process is convoluted and confusing and backlogged and doesn't make sense and is complex, that is our problem to deal with and to solve. It is never the fault of the person traveling to a new place without power, without voice, for our broken system, right? So am I an advocate of fixing our broken system? Absolutely. But what I'm certainly not an advocate for is blaming the person without power, without voice, with nothing, coming over here because they've heard about this utopian country where anything is possible and there's freedom, right? The people who are here want to be here, evident by the fact that they're here.
As Christians, I think we are called to be their voice.
Let's step in together to the story of the New Testament. And we'll learn about the Sephardian woman, or the Syrian woman for short. This happens in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 7, verses 24 through 30. And in this story, Jesus is hiding out in Syria. He's kind of keeping a low profile. And the Syrian woman comes to Jesus and interrupts what he's doing and insists that Jesus help her heal her sick daughter. And so there's already some ethnic, racial tensions around the story. This Syrian woman confronting a Jewish leader, Jesus, probably unheard of, and kind of asserting herself and saying, you know, what you're doing, stop what you're doing and come help me, is basically what the Syrian woman is asking Jesus to do. And Jesus's reaction here is unlike the Jesus that you and I are probably familiar with. Jesus basically says, get out of here. The children are still hungry. We're not going to give their food to the dogs. Calls this woman a dog. Not very polite. And there are two kind of ways to hear this story. You could just think that Jesus's impulse reaction in this story was probably maybe racist, prejudice, mean, certainly, and um, and so this woman teaches Jesus, the human Jesus here in this story, teaches Jesus a lesson about compassion, and moves Jesus to finally help her out. That's one way to read it. Another way you could read this story um, is that this is Jesus providing a a mirror for the current culture, teaching, showing them that this is the current culture. The current culture would say, "Get out of here, you dog!" Right? Um, and then, in order to amplify the end of the story, when he does show compassion and mercy and how it's supposed to be, he knows what the woman is going to say before she says it, and what she says that moves Jesus when he says, uh, you know, I'm not going to feed the children's food to the dogs. She replies, even the dogs eat from the crumbs of the master's table. It's a brilliant rhetorical rebuke of what Jesus originally said. And Jesus basically says, after she says that, you're right, I was wrong. And he helps her out, shows her compassion and mercy because of that line. So it's a good story about the importance of standing up, to speaking out, speaking truth to power, and no more powerful thing than Jesus, right? Standing up and fighting for equality and representation. And it's really amazing that um, how this woman says it. She's acknowledging Jesus's ministry. She's saying what you're doing is important, but even the dogs eat from the crumbs of the master's table. That's a beautiful way to convince Jesus, because she's not dismissing his ministry. She's saying, do what you do, but also the crumbs are for all people. You know, I should be included in the compassion and mercy. And so, if you are somebody who's been told you're unworthy or not good enough, or you've been marginalized or counted out or bullied in society, I bet you this story hits differently. And I hope it encourages you and inspires you to stand up, to speak truth to power. And this is a beautiful story of God moving to see the immigrant woman, the Syrian woman. Um, and I love the complexity of the story and how difficult it is to wrestle with and discern. But the point, I think, is that this Syrian woman teaches Jesus about compassion. I wonder what immigrants and migrants, minorities, people persecuted in our country can teach us about compassion. How might an immigrant hear this story?
Immigrants nowadays, as we all know, they're so afraid and intimidated, they won't even go out of their homes. They won't even go to work. Yeah, that's very hard to overcome.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that I think that story has a side of, how do we react with compassion? It calls us to look at how we're looking at this whole issue. Are we being compassionate? Or are we the ones who are turning them away, even though they ought to be looked with compassion and not hatred or um, um, discouraging intent or whatever else you want to call
How I would characterize the Syrian woman is um, very strategically astute. You know, um, it's important that she doesn't, like my reaction was when Jesus called her a dog, you know, to be insulting and say, "Well, who the heck do you think you are? You so and so, and calling me a dog, and and it's not that reaction. Instead, it is even the dogs eat from the master's table. In other words, she is revealing to Jesus what true compassion and inclusion looks like. And I think that's part of what we're called to do as well. And, if we're thinking about how to right some of the wrongs that we see in the world, the key, and I know this feels like it's a tall order, but the key is to reveal what compassion looks like, to model what the right way of living is. And that's why it's so important that in the face of being told false narratives about people, we, people who aren't bashful about our voice, um, because we don't have, I feel a heightened sense of responsibility, as especially a white man who's a pastor. I feel a heightened sense of responsibility to speak up for the voiceless because they're afraid, they're voiceless, and so I think it's part of our job to provide a voice for people like this Syrian woman. Now, Amen, God bless for Syrian women like her who do have the audacity to confront the powers, but most people, you know, don't. And so our job is somebody who's not the Syrian woman, but somebody who is a in the same club that Jesus is in the religious elite, is to be the one to reveal what compassion and love and kindness looks like. Our voice has power, and I think that our relationship, our collective relationship, and our individual relationships, especially with immigrants, are only made more important by the current context that we're in. They provide an opportunity for us to reveal what compassion looks like. No, it's not as important if you're compassionate to people that look the same or think the same as you do. Why your compassion matters is that you're revealing it to people who are different, people not in the same social class or status, people of different races or ethnicities, or people who are not you, right? That's why compassion matters. And so I kind of view this as a test, even though that's very egocentric, I realize, but this is sort of a test of, are we going to live into our values of welcome and inclusion, or are we not?
It's as important to be compassionate of the people that we have a natural affinity for than it is for the people that we don't. I'm working on it.
We conclude with the story we hear around Christmas time. After Jesus is born, Jesus, Joseph, and Mary, they all become refugees. Refugee is defined as someone fleeing to another land because they were persecuted where they are. So when Jesus is born, King Herod is paranoid, and he sends a decree to kill every firstborn son of his own people because he doesn't want Jesus to be raised into adulthood. He's threatened by Jesus, that Jesus will become a new king. So he orders them all the firstborn sons, to be killed, thinking that Jesus will be one of the murdered. Joseph packs up the family and they head to the land of Egypt for safety. They are refugees. They stay in the land of Egypt until King Herod dies. I wonder what it means to be welcoming to people who are fleeing persecution today. What people don't often realize is that where migrants most often come from are war torn places around the world that are only poor, not because they're inferior, but because of the geopolitical circumstances that their country is surrounded in. A lot of our policies as the United States are deeply involved in why countries are impoverished around the world. And poverty leads to persecution and crime. If you want to solve crime, you solve poverty. That's just how the world works. And what's frustrating often is that people in the United States take for granted, or often are unaware of, the role that we play in keeping countries around the world impoverished, and then act surprised when there is persecution. You see, when people come to the United States, they come here seeking safety and refuge. They've heard about this land where all people are created equal, where there is opportunity and where dreams come true. The people who come to this country have made the decision that this country will extend to them an open arm and warm embrace because of what they've heard about this place. They're here because they love the aspiration of what our country stands for. It's interesting in this Christmas story, we hear the story of the Magi. The Magi are foreigners that come from out of town to see the baby Jesus. The foreign Magi, they're faithful, devoted. The Hebrew, Herod, is the villain in this story. The divine family is all of us. And the innkeeper that eventually welcomed the Holy Family invites them in once he recognizes Joseph. Oh, you're Joseph. You're Joseph. I know you. You're welcome here. You're family here. You see, the part of what the entire Bible's mission is to create a world in which we see strangers as friends and we see friends as family. This familial language used all throughout the Bible, it isn't just your immediate family, your literal circle of family. It is that. But the whole project of the Bible, throughout the Old Testament and the New, is to ever expand our understanding of family. Because you are born in this world, you are a precious child of God. Because you are a precious child of God, that makes you my sibling. And because you are my sibling, that means you will receive my love and compassion. We are one family in this together. When I fall, you fall. When you fall, I fall. We are in this together. The sooner we realize that, the sooner we can understand, not just hear the words of Scripture, but understand the narrative and the whole point. Our family is one, and our family is one in God. Do you often think about Jesus? Have you ever thought about Jesus as a refugee? What does that image evoke in you?
Well, I've heard that before, and it makes me think that that's why he's so good at his job, so to speak.
I'll leave you with a couple quotes. This is from Hebrew chapter 11, verse 1. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for and the hope of things not seen. Part of that dream that isn't realized yet, but it is a constant quest and a constant moving toward the kingdom of God that I think is so apparently revealed in Scripture. And it's our job to know these stories, not to know them in an intellectual way, but to know them in a heartfelt way. So we don't just hear the stories, but we understand what they mean and how they apply to the world we live in today. For me, the question is not, will God welcome us? The question is, will we welcome God?